Hey there Blenderheads, my name is Matt Heimlich and welcome to the third video in my Blender hair training series. Now at the end of the last video we left off having just combed our hair here, set up pretty much the same exact way it was at the end of that. The only thing I have added is I've added this empty here in the middle, and to that I've parented the camera so that if I move the empty, I move the camera. Well, I should be looking through the camera views yet. If I move the empty, I move the camera. If I rotate the empty, I rotate the camera. Basically just an easier way to switch between a front and a side for rendering purposes. Now this is a pretty in-depth video. We're going to be going into the materials for the Blender internal rendering engine. Now I'll preface this entire video by saying that doing proper hair rendering is very memory intensive. Just this simple setup here, when I render, I max out at about 2.5 gigabytes of RAM, which probably won't be a big deal for a lot of you, but I know for some people they're not running a system that has a ton of RAM in it, so you have to keep that in mind. There are some tricks you can do that I'll show you to decrease the memory that you need, but they also sacrifice visual fidelity as you're doing that. So I'll go over those in this video, but just keep in mind that you may not be able to do everything that is shown in this video just due to system limitations. With that in mind, let us jump right in. Look over here, select the mesh that our emitter is on, and we will take a look at these hair settings. As I said, I haven't changed anything between the last video and this one, so these are all the same. We're going to look at some settings first of all that are important for setting up hair. The most important in the particle panel is right here, and that is strand render. You want to make sure that is turned on. The other one that is important here is the material setting. If you're using material emitters, this probably won't be a huge issue unless you have multiple hair systems on one emitter, and in that case you can just click through. But on this one we only have one material, so we're going to leave it at 1. Right now that material is a simple white Phong material. What we are going to do is basically change this so that it is suited for rendering these individual little strands of hair. The settings that we are going to touch today are diffuse, the diffuse setting here, specular, the specular setting. We're going to give it some translucency. We're going to give it some transparency in the form of an alpha mask. And we're going to play with these strand settings here to get something that looks acceptable. We won't be touching really anything down here, except off the bat you want to go ahead and turn on Receive Transparent, and you want to do that for both your hair and for anything your hair might be casting a shadow on. Now right now the head mesh doesn't have a material, so we're going to go ahead and add a new material, and this is just going to be nothing fancy, just like little skin colored shader. And like I said, we're going to go down here and turn on Receive Transparent. Alright, we'll switch back here. Now there's no lights in the scene, so we're going to go ahead and add some lights. Hair in Blender Internal can only be rendered correctly with spotlights. You can use other lights, but you'll get really bad looking results. So I'm going to go ahead here and we're going to set up a simple 3-point lighting setup. Now what that is it's a basic studio setup where you have a key light. So this is going to be our key. We're going to put it over here to the side, kind of angling in, and we're going to have it aiming down. We're going to make this one kind of a little bit of a yellowish tinge. When I model this, I model in real-world units, so you can do that yourself by going to the scene panel over here and going to units. I like to model in metric just because it's pretty standard within the industry, but you can also change to imperial if you're more comfortable with feet and inches, or you can use none, which will use Blender Internal, where each one of these squares is a Blender unit. Well, I should say each one of these squares is a Blender unit, which is about equal to 1 meter. As I said, I model in metric, so this head is about 23 centimeters tall, which is about the average for a male head. Now, I know that probably seems like a bit of a tangent, but the reason I do that is because of the way that energy is calculated in Blender Eternal. We are using an inverse square falloff, which is physically accurate, and what we're going to do is change the distance to 40 centimeters because we don't need light any further than that. And we also need to lower the energy by about half to make sure that we don't get a blown out render. So there's our first light. Now we're going to add our second light here, and this is going to be our fill light. Now the fill light I'm just going to put off to the side here, and it's going to be coming in directly at just a 90-degree angle to the head. This one we're going to give a little bit of a bluish tinge. And this one we're going to do a little bit weaker than the other one, so I'm going to put this at 0.35. And all these measurements I'm using, they're just standard 3-point lighting measurements. This one, because you can see the cone is cutting through the head, we're going to go down here to the spot shape and increase the size a little bit so that it includes that whole head. And we might as well go ahead and do the same for the other one. Like I said, there's going to be nothing fancy about this lighting setup here. It's just going to be very, very simple. Alright, and finally we're going to add a rim light. So the rim light goes behind the mesh and kind of points at the camera. So we're going to put this back here, and it's just going to be pointing directly at the camera, and we're going to make this one very wide. And we're going to make this one pretty strong too, so we're going to give it a value of 1, and we're just going to keep that white. So with this basic lighting setup and cameras already added, we'll knock this down to 1000 by 1000 just for the sake of speeding the render up. And when you're doing hair renders, you want to make sure you have your anti-aliasing relatively high, because they are such small fibers that without anti-aliasing they'll basically look just like a bunch of blocks. So make sure you have that turned up. I have it turned up really high because it doesn't really affect my system that much when I have it turned on, but it may be a little bit different for you. So with these basic settings, let's go ahead and do a test render. Now the first thing you'll notice is that looks awful. We've got this big black bar running down the middle of the face. We've got this completely white blown out hair that you can't even tell the individual strands apart. It almost looks like it's like you know, an alpha value for where the hair is supposed to be. And that's simply because of our material settings and also because of some of our lamp settings, and I'll show you what is causing that here in just a moment. But first, let's take care of this big black bar running down the middle of the head. That's obviously kind of unsightly for a final render. And with spotlights, it's kind of hard to get a complete coverage without going crazy with the number of spotlights. So a trick that some people use for when you're using buffer shadows like this and when you're rendering in an engine like Blender Internal, what we can do is add a hemi light and have it basically pointing up from the ground. And with that, we can turn the energy down way low, like 0.2, and just leave it at a gray. And if we go ahead and do another test render, you should see that it kind of fills everything in, makes it look like almost like there's light coming from an environment somewhere, even though we have environment lighting turned off for this render. Obviously you could turn on environment lighting here and get a similar effect, but that can also add additional problems when you're trying to work on your hair materials and whatnot. So I prefer to use the hemi light when I am setting up hair and whatnot. So let's go back to the emitting mesh so we can play with the materials a little bit more. Now, the first thing that most people get wrong about their hair is that hair is a lot less shiny than a lot of people assume it is when they're setting up materials. Unless you're filming like a Herbal Essences commercial, it's going to be pretty dull on a day-to-day basis. So we'll go ahead and pick a color here, and we're just going to make him, like I said in the last video, kind of like a dark brown hair. And obviously, you see we have this big spot here, and that's our specular highlight. as I said, depending on your character and the look you're going for, this is going to vary. In some tests I've done for this one in between these videos, I found that about 0.02 was a good value for the specular for his hair. And for hardness you want to keep relatively high, because when we turn on some of these settings here that calculate these individual strands as hair objects, for lighting purposes, you want a pretty hard highlight on each one so that they're defined against the head instead of looking like just a big monochromatic blob on top of the head. So you want to keep this pretty high. I found 350 to be a good value. The other things we want to change here are, we're going to go from a diffuse to an Oren-Nayar shading method, and basically it's a more physically accurate diffuse shading method. You can control the roughness as well, and something around 0.4 is normally good for hair. And in the specular, we're going to change that to a Blinn instead of a Cook-Torrance shading model. And the reason for that is it's just a much tighter specular highlight. As you can see here, we have that little dot, and if we change it back to the Cook-Torrance, you can see it increases like that. And no matter how high we crank that, we'll never get as tight of a specular highlight as we will with the Blinn. So let's go ahead and give that a test render, and you can see what that's already changed. Alright, as you can tell, that's already much better than that original white blown out render. It still looks like there's just plastic strands coming off the top of his head, though, so there's some more work to be done. Now, one of the biggest things that a lot of people get wrong when they're first doing hair is they forget to turn this on right here, and it's very simple, just turning on tangent shading. We're also going to add a little bit of translucency to hair, because in real life when you light hair from behind, it lets a little bit of light through, and a translucency value of about 0.2 seems to let the right amount of light through to simulate or to properly grab that rim light from behind, or however else your scene might be lit, and to give a proper value. Strand here is very important for setting up a good hair material. As I covered in the previous video, what this does is basically you can set how wide the root is in pixels, how wide the tip is in pixels, and the minimum size. And the width fade is across the hair, how much it fades the alpha value automatically. These are going to be different for every hair type, and you really do just have to mess around with them to get something that looks correct to you or for the purposes of your character. For this one, I found that 0.9 and 0.7 were good values, and for a minimum I'm just going to leave it at 0.7 because I don't want it to fade anything for me. We're going to do that manually to get a little more control. The width fade we're going to set to 0.2, and the surface distance, now this is how much it blends the surface normal with the hair normal before it starts taking over. And we have short hair, so it is going to give a little bit of effect. We're going to turn this to something very low, to like 8 millimeters. Here we can change the shape. Right now they're going to be pretty square hairs. As you can see, when you turn it positive, the value, or the hairs round off at the end. When you turn it negative, the hairs kind of spike. So we're going to make this a negative 0.15. And that should be all we need to touch here right now. So let's give that a test render and see what we've got. Alright, as you can see, we've already got a decently convincing hair setup here. You can see some individual hairs in here. You've got good highlights coming off of everything, and it generally looks okay. But you've still got, it looks empty, if you will. It still kind of looks like it's just, a plastic mold on top of the head. And this is where we have to get into the lamp properties. This is the reason, in particular, why you need to render with spotlights to get an acceptable looking render. And the way we do that is we leave it on buffer shadow, but we change to these deep buffers. And basically what that does is, before rendering starts, it calculates kind of a depth map of your hair and any objects in the scene, and tries to estimate how light is going to be casting shadow through there. It basically treats it as a volume rather than a series of individual hairs. So you can see as soon as I change these, without changing any other settings, what kind of difference this will make. So we'll go ahead and render. And as you can see, that already added a little bit more definition to the hair, especially in areas like this, where hairs are casting shadow onto one another. There's some other stuff we have to do, because right now it's not casting shadows onto the head, and they're really not even casting that many shadows on themselves, and that is because of this setting right here. And this one took me forever to find out. You know, I was scouring IRC and forums and trying to figure out the cause of this, and it turns out to be relatively simple. Here we have the clip start, and basically that means that anything closer than this to the light is not going to cast any shadows at all. Like I said, because I model in real world values, this is only about 30, maybe 30 centimeters away from the light. And as you can see, this clip start is at 50 centimeters. So what we're going to do is set that to 1 centimeter. Now, you don't want to set it to 0 or you'll get some weird artifacts through your whole scene. Yeah, setting it to 1 centimeter is, seems to be good for calculating those buffer shadows. So we'll go ahead and do another render and see what that changed for us. Alright, now you can see obviously it added a lot more definition to the hair there, and the hair is actually casting shadow onto the head as well, but it has no definition at all, and we need to go in and change that. And the way that we do that is by playing with these values here. Now this is where your memory use is going to ramp up pretty quickly. That last one peaked out at 514 megabytes of RAM needed. But as we change these, you'll see that they can go up really quickly. Now these sample buffers are basically anti-aliasing for the shadow pass. The size is the size of the map that is projected for shadows. You want to keep that pretty high, as high as your system can handle, definitely. For the sake of this, just for time, I'm going to set it to 2048, and it squares that, so it's like it's a 2K image texture that it creates from that. And samples is how many samples it takes going through and when it starts creating the shadow map. And I found that 6 is a pretty good number for that. And I am going to turn up the sample buffers. For the filter type, this doesn't change a whole lot. I prefer the look of a Gaussian filter over a box filter just because it is a more comprehensive filter, but it does take up more memory and it does take a little more time. Soft, I'm going to turn that down to 1 just because I want to be able to see the shadow definitions for these renders. And I'm going to go ahead and put the same values in for these other 2 lamps as well. Alright, let's give that a render and see what we got. As you can see, the creating shadow buffers step here is taking quite a bit longer than it was before. Still not too crazy though. Alright. As you can see, we've got some really good definition on the hairs. They got a nice color to them. Yeah, I'm thinking that might be still be a little bit too specular. This is kind of looking like a model photo shoot hair right now, where they gel it up and give it a nice sheen and Photoshop in post. So we're going to go in to the base head and turn that even to 0.01 and give that another render. Yeah, I like the look of that quite a bit more. Getting some good shadows cast by the hair. All right. Okay. The next step we're going to do here is this hair is a little bit spiky up here at the tips, and what we're going to do is we're going to add a color map so that we can both change the color of the hair along these strands, because hair tends to lighten up a little bit as it gets towards the tips. And it's also going to allow us to give an alpha value to individual strands that will help with the kind of aliasing issues we get up here at the tips. So to do that, we hop into the textures panel. It's right next to the materials panel. We give it a new texture, and we're going to give it a blend. Now, when you're in blend, you're going to go down here to colors and turn on a ramp. By default, the ramp has two control points. One end is black and one end is white. The black end has an alpha value of 0. And what we're going to do first off is click that. First, click this black end, this little dotted line right here. Then click here in the color. We're going to turn the alpha value to 1 because we want this end to be the end that is completely opaque. And here we're going to give this a dark brown color. And we're going to give this end, we're going to give this end that same dark brown color, but we're going to give it an alpha value of about 0.2 so that it is pretty see-through on that end. We're also going to maybe lighten that one up just a tad. Now, you can do that either by dragging this up or going into here and changing the value. So we're going to drag that up just a bit there. And we're going to add a couple more control points. This control point here, we're going to keep that at 100% alpha. And we're going to drag this pretty close to the edge. And this one is 0.2 alpha, so we're going to give this one a 0.5 alpha. And that's just to give a good fall off to the hairs here. And after that, two important steps are to change the coordinates under mapping to strand particle, and to have it influence both the color and the alpha value. Up here we'll show alpha, and you can see how the fall off is kind of working here. This control point here, we're going to drop the alpha to like 0.8 just to give it an even fall off. Alright, and right now we have that affecting everything correctly. So I'm going to go ahead and give this a render and see what we got. Alright, and as you can see, that made a big difference to the way that the hair looks here. It kind of fades off to a lighter color as it grows out, and it gives a good bit of color differentiation as it, or over the entire head. So this is a pretty good hair setup here in Blender. You can take it a little further and go into some subsurface scattering and whatnot, but that really, really changes your render time for the worse. You know, easily quadrupling or even more your render times, which not a big deal in this case. We could sit here and wait for it if we wanted to, but if you're dealing with a complex character with facial hair and rim hair and maybe a beard and stuff like that, that'll get your render times up to easily 30 minutes plus for a simple head like this. What I am going to do is crank this up to a 2000 by 2000 render, so that you can get a look at the definition we get out of a render like this. Alright, if you take a look there, we've got really good definition on individual hairs, even within the volume of the hairs itself. Good shading, pretty good variation. Yeah, I'm decently happy with the result here we've gotten with this material. We will go ahead and do a side render as well. I don't expect it to be perfect because we didn't spend a ton of time on the combing phase, but why not? Why don't we see what we have? So we'll just rotate that around 90 degrees to the side of the head using the empty, and we'll go ahead and do another render. Alright, obviously we got some coverage issues here, and that's just partially because of the combing job, partially because it wouldn't probably hurt to add a couple more control strands in this area. And like I said, you can do that by going to particle edit mode using the add brush, and just, you know, maybe setting it to 10, putting a couple here, a couple here, a couple in this area, and just getting that set up in a way that the children look good. But as you can see up in these areas here where the hair is thick enough, we do get a very good result. hair is definitely one of the things that Blender does the best if you know how to set it up. It definitely is not an easy setup, like it will be in the next video when we cover this same type of deal for Cycles hair. You'll see how easy that is in comparison. But rendering in Cycles, especially for animation, is not always an option for people. Blender is much quicker. As you can see, this frame here took only 30 seconds, and this is above an HD frame, a 1080p HD at that. And this has 16 times anti-aliasing, so obviously you can get really fast animation results in Blender internal, but when you start, cranking everything up, it gets to the point where the time and the setup time, or the render time and the setup time, you start losing that advantage that you have over Cycles anyway. But that is a topic for the next video. Yeah, that is basically all the settings that you need to be aware of for setting up a good hair shader in Blender. To just summarize all that, the big ones are making sure you're not too specular. Hair is not as shiny as a lot of people seem to think it is. Make sure your tangent shading is turned on to capture the light correctly off of individual strands. Give it a little bit of translucency. Make sure these strand settings are correct for your case. On top of that, you can add this color and alpha ramp to give you a little bit more control over the hairs, and you want to make sure that under your particle settings that you have strand render turned on. Now for fun, why don't we just go ahead and take a look at it, what would have happened if I hadn't done that, because I did that a few times and could not figure out what was going wrong for a while. So let's take a look. We'll turn off strand render, and you can see the kind of ugly result you get if you don't have that. As you can see, without strand render, it kind of treats them as individual primitives, so your render time is much, much longer. Enabling strand render enables some behind-the-scenes acceleration structures that are much better at grabbing the information from the hairs, or it grabs the information from the hairs and packages them in a much more efficient way for the renderer to handle. As you can see, we do, without strand render turned on, we just get this ugly, flat kind of color. Still casts a shadow, but it's just kind of hideous. It's definitely not something you want to do a final render with, or any render for that matter. So yeah, definitely make sure you have that turned on. Aside from that, there's not much to cover in Blender internal hair. You will have to kind of play with these settings a little bit to get something good for your individual cases, especially in the strand settings here and the specular. But yeah, aside from that, this is a pretty thorough covering of the materials, good material settings for Blender internal. So yeah, I will see you in the next video where we will cover basically the same thing but with Cycles materials. And to do that, you will need a Cycles build that has the new patch applied to it, but I'll show you how to get all that in the next video. Aside from that, as always, feel free to like and subscribe, and leave me a comment. Let me know what I'm doing well and what I'm not doing well, and I will see you next time. Thank you very much.